everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor John Dominic Crossan. Today we're going to be talking about the cross that spoke and also his other book, Resurrecting Easter. But the title of this stream is specifically The Cross Gospel and the Resurrection. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. He has prepared for us a PowerPoint presentation, or actually he sent me images and I put it in the PowerPoint presentation. And we're going to go through them. So my first question for you, Dr. Crossan, is in the book, The Cross Gospel, you talk about a hypothetical document that you named the Cross Gospel. And it's supposed to be some sort of earlier version of the Gospel of Peter. What are the main points, would you say, that led you to the conclusion that this gospel existed?
Okay, can I please allow me to hold your question for a second, Jacob, because I want to look at the big picture for a moment. Let me begin with two facts before we get into what you quite rightly call a hypothesis. Every single major event, say, in the life of Jesus is pretty much described in the New Testament somewhere. If you want to know about the entry into Jerusalem, you can know where to find it. The one that's missing, now this is a fact, it's obvious, but it's never mentioned. The one that's missing is the actual scene of the resurrection itself. Now, I'm not talking about the effects, the results, the consequences, such as the finding of the empty tomb or apparitions of Jesus. Leave aside for a moment whether those are factual or not. They are consequences. They are not the event itself. The most important event in the life of Jesus is never recorded anywhere in the New Testament Gospels. Now, that's a fact. Secondly, and this is a fact too, the Western tradition of the resurrection, Western Christianity, and the Eastern tradition of the resurrection are totally, radically different, irrespective of what you think about them. Whether you're looking at the theology or the iconography, they're radically different, which means, if I may be blunt, that any Western theologian, and I'm a Western theologian, who's talking about the resurrection and ignoring the East is Eurocentric, to be polite. You could use harsher terms, let's say just Eurocentric. So those are the two general backgrounds, as I see now 30 years after I wrote The Cross That Spoke. Now let me come back to your question. What happened to me way back in 1988, I was working towards the big book on the historical Jesus, the life of Mediterranean Jewish peasant of 1991, and I was doing all the various parts, the parables, the aphorisms. I started working on the, let me call them, the Easter traditions, for a better name, the execution, the trial, the execution. I'm using that term deliberately to remind us it is an execution. It's not just something else, execution. And I began to notice something. There was this text. Now, could we put up maybe my first slide as I'm talking, if you would, please, Jacob? We're going to be mentioning two places in the next minute. I put in Nag Hammadi. This is obviously the northern part of the Nile, heading towards the delta, as you can see up there, like a mushroom or something, or an umbrella. Nag Hammadi I just put in because you probably know about it. Akhmim, it's a second place called Akhmim. It's about 60 miles north of Nag Hammadi. And then another place, Oxyrhynchus, which is about halfway between Akhmim and Cairo in the delta, let's say. And what's going to be important about Oxyrhynchus is that around 1900, round numbers, two Oxford scholars discovered a rubbish heap, basically a giant rubbish heap, from which they have extracted and are still publishing tens of thousands of fragments. So now, if you go to the second one, please. All right. Before we get into hypothesis, we are dealing here with a real document. It's a document you could hold if they let you with gloves on and everything else. And we have at least a major part of it. What you're dealing with is apparently a monk who wanted to take with him into the grave a little prayer book for eternity, as it were. Maybe it was his favorite prayer book. He had written out certain texts, and he'd written out this text, which we now call the Gospel of Peter, because it mentions Peter, Peter. So it's called the Gospel of Peter. Again, I repeat, this is a text, a document. It's not a hypothesis. When I was looking at this, now we're moving from fact to interpretation, it seemed to me that this document, and by the way, you can see to the right on your screen, we've found two other papyri. They're coming from Oxyrhynchus. You can see the difference. In 1972, one was published, and it was only up to Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 2949, counting. And then by 1993, 20 years later, we'd managed to get up to 4009. So these are still coming out regularly. I think they've scanned them fast to make certain of ones of most interest. But we're dealing with a manuscript, and we're dealing with two other fragments. All right. The manuscript itself is dated, and as you know, paleographers, and I am not a paleographer. I have to depend on paleographers to tell me, usually using the type of script, because in theory, maybe every 25 years or so, the script tends to change as a new school starts to learn calligraphy. And you can see how dicey that is. Supposing I'm an old curmudgeon-y scribe and I've learned to write and I'm still 60, 70 years of age and I'm still writing the way I learned and I'm not changing. Well, that could throw you off completely when you get one of my manuscripts. So on the one hand, it's sort of scientific. On the other hand, it's a little bit slippery, not because of people, but because of the writers themselves. And it also gets highly controversial. I mean, this is delicate, and I'm not accusing anyone of malfeasance, but if you sort of want this to be coming from Jesus, maybe you're inclined to push towards the first, early 2nd century. And if you think it's some weird stuff that you don't like, maybe you're inclined to push it a little bit later. But in any case, what we have is a text which dates to the 700s or the 800s, the text itself. There's not much debate on that. And then these two other fragments. You can see the middle fragment, of which there are two pieces, and then the one to the right. And in general, I'm not going to say there's a consensus. There's a strong argument that these are parts of a fuller Gospel of Peter. So it is possible that the Gospel of Peter was actually, once upon a time, a full gospel. By that, I mean it may have started sort of with John the Baptist, went to the life of Jesus, and then ended up with the fragment we have, which starts in the middle of the trial, right in the middle of the trial, goes through crucifixion, etc., and ends with visions, looks like by the Sea of Galilee. Now, that's the data. My hypothesis is, and I made 3 points in that book. One, there is a source. Let me back up. No, let me put it this way. The Gospel of Peter is a typical 2nd century text which seeks to combine the more or less canonical versions with an extra version not in the canon. So it's typical what was going on in the 2nd century when people were disturbed if Matthew said Jesus said it this way and Luke said it that way. Couldn't you sort of combine them somehow and get them into agreement? So my argument was it has a source independent of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. It has a source independent. I still am convinced of that. Now, the delicate argument, of course, is when you find something like this, is it simply based on what we have? Did somebody read Mark or Matthew or Luke or John and sort of compose it for whatever reason? Maybe they were more pro-Roman than maybe they were anti-Jewish. So there are scholars, and it's an honorable scholarly opinion, that this is simply a Reader's Digest condensed version of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and therefore of not great value. Some interest, but minimal interest. What was very significant is I also made two other claims. I said there was a source in there. I said this source looked to me, interpretation, as even more primitive than the versions in the New Testament, more primitive than Mark or Matthew or Luke or John. And I made a third claim, that maybe they were even based on this. That's why you see the title of the cross that spoke, The Origins of the Passion Resurrection. So three claims. There is a source in there. Not saying anything about it. There is a source in there. It's independent of the canonical versions. May even be earlier than them, I claimed it was, by comparing them. And they may be even based on it. I think it would be fair to tell you and your audience that the massive consensus was that Crossan is kind of nuts. But here's what's interesting. Most of the focus was on my second and third claim, that it was earlier and that maybe the canonicals were based on it. They weren't totally focusing on the first part. Maybe if I had to write the book again, I would simply make the first part and put it out there and see what happens. Because people get very nervous when anything in the New Testament is based on something we don't have. I noticed, for example, that Father Ray Brown, great Roman Catholic scholar, who argued completely against me in his monumental work, the death of the Passion of the Messiah, the death of the Messiah. But he actually agreed that there was an independent source in there. And some scholars noticed that. Say, wait a minute now, he disagrees on the other two things, but he agrees there's an independent source in there. So that might be the most important thing we'd want to look at today. Is there an independent source in there? And the reason I have the other book up there is because I think the strongest, irrefutable, I'm going to say, to use a strong word, irrefutable part of the argument is that the resurrection is an independent source. You can argue maybe more about the trial, about the crucifixion, maybe about the burial, but the more important thing would be to argue on the source. That's still the question I would like, especially for today, to raise. So let me give you, just for example, the sort of arguments. What I've done is because of this, I didn't try to read the whole thing to you because I don't know how to do that without driving us all insane. I took a key moment in the trial, the crucifixion, the guarded tomb. Now, the guarded tomb, as you may know, the guards at the tomb are found only in Matthew. Only in Matthew. And they're also found here. So we'll get to that in a minute. So the trial we'll talk about, the guarded tomb or the burial, and the resurrection we'll talk about as well. Okay? So here's the trial. Matthew is the one you know. Pilate saw he could do nothing. A riot was beginning, took some water. Pilate washed his hands and says, I am innocent. This man's blood. See to it yourselves. That's clear enough. In theory, the Roman governor or sub-governor Pilate exculpates himself. I have nothing to do with this. I won't condemn this man. Now, the very next thing, as you know, he does is actually crucify him. So much for innocence. Here's what the Gospel of Peter says. It begins with this fragment. It opens up in the middle of a sentence almost. Of the Jews, none washed their hands, neither Herod nor any one of his judges. And as they would not wash, Pilate arose. Then Herod the king, this would be presumably Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, he's not a king, by the way, he was a tetrarch, commanded that the Lord should be marched off, saying to them, presumably his soldiers, do what I have commanded you to do to him. So at least in the trial here, Pilate is really exculpated pretty much completely. It's Antipas and his soldiers who are running the trial and seems to be running the crucifixion. So one argument then would be, which looks more original in there? Somebody might say, well, this is trying to exculpate Pilate even more so than you find them in the New Testament, and it's blaming Herod Antipas or Herod the king. Or maybe you might say it doesn't even know what it's talking about. It thinks it's Herod the Great. So that's the first thing. And you can see the difficulties of trying to argue which came first. Now, go back to my first point. This looks different. Some scholar might say, no, he simply read Matthew and he wants to blame the Jews and exculpate the Romans. And lo and behold, this is what we got. But hold on to that for a moment. That's a major difference in the trial scene. Can we go to the next one, please, Jacob? In the crucifixion, what you have in the Gospel of Peter, I put it up there first now. One of the, remember the two malefactors, as it says, the two evildoers who are on either side of Jesus. One of them rebukes him. We have landed in suffering for our deeds of wickedness we have committed. This man who's become the savior of men, what wrong has he done? That's all you get in the Gospel of Peter. No, I won't read the full thing in Luke because I think you know right well what happens. One of the criminals who is hanged with him says, save yourself. He kind of mocks him. Oh, if you're so great, save yourself and us. But the other rebukes him. So you have a kind of a backwards and forwards between the two criminals. And Jesus, and he says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus replies, you'll be with me today in heaven. When I looked at those two, I found it difficult, I understand, to say that if the Gospel of Peter had read Luke, as it were, would it really have left out the really good part about, remember me when you come into your kingdom? Truly, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. Or was it an expansion on the Gospel of Peter? Again, I leave it to your own intelligence. You see, the arguments are very slippery. Somebody could easily say, well, he looked at Luke and said, that's too long. Let's leave out the what's happening? Which came first? Which came first, the hen or the eggs? All right, let me look at the next one. But you notice now I'm building up that. Is the difference enough to make you think this looks like a different source?
Before we get to the next slide, we got a super chat question from Myth Vision Podcast. Thank you for the $5, Derek. He says, amazing guest, Dr. Crossan. When Paul says Jesus was buried, what kind of burial do you suggest Jesus had? Common grave? Love you guys.
Okay, let me go into this without losing our continuity. When Paul says buried, I'm not convinced that he's really thinking of a burial at all. I think it's like you and I might say he's dead and buried, almost like hyphenated, dead and buried. It kind of affirms really dead. So I think when Paul says dead and buried, I think what he's after is Jesus was really dead. Now, there wasn't some kind of a mistake that he was just, I don't know if he's thinking, I would put it positively, I don't think at all he's thinking about the finding of an empty tomb. I don't think he's thinking about that at all. That's another question, why that? So I think his dead and buried doesn't mean anything more than we might say dead and buried. And if I said, where's the person buried? You say, well, I don't know. I just mean he was dead and buried. He's certainly dead. It's a way of saying certainly dead. So I don't think it gets into that. But we may want later to talk, because that's an historical question. And at the moment, we're not talking about an historical question. We're talking about two versions of it, whether there's a source here. At the end of this, I will come back, if you remind me, go back to what do I think as a historian about the burial of Jesus when I read all the materials. I will come back to that. So let me go back then. I think we're ready for a third one, Jacob. I think with the guard.
Oh, yeah, he's got another question that he super chatted. Let's take a look at that real quick, and then we'll move on. Vision, thank you for the $5 again. When Christian apologists tried to argue that Jesus was crucified, buried, and rose again, literally, how would you respond to these bold claims?
Well, the first thing I would tell them, and I'm going to be very blunt on this, most Christians, and I'm saying this to most scholars too, when they use the term rose, they don't know what they're talking about. Because rose in the first century, resurrection, did not mean the same as, for example, ascension. This gets me into the whole book Resurrecting Easter, so I'm kind of dancing carefully not to jump too far ahead. But please understand, in the first century, there was a pan-Mediterranean understanding that very holy people like Moses, or very powerful people like Romulus, could be taken up to God or the gods upon death. If they happened to die, it didn't make any difference. They were raised up. The term is apotheosis in Greek. They were raised up. Now, resurrection is not a pan-Mediterranean. It's not a pan-Jewish. It's a sectarian, Pharisaic concept. It has to do with the fact that there is justice in this universe, and at the end of time, God will raise all the human race for judgment, and heaven and hell as sanctions. That's the claim of Pharisaic Judaism in the first century, which says to the Sadducees, who are quite happy with the way the world is and thinks it's perfectly just since they're running it under the Romans, of course. The Pharisees say, no, this world is a just place. It's just postponed judgment. Therefore, there will be sanctions. So if you're talking about, as Paul talks about Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, being raised in the sense of anastasis, that's the key word, you're making a huge claim that anastasis, resurrection with Jesus, is the beginning of the general resurrection. And Paul says that absolutely clearly in 1 Corinthians 15. In fact, he says, if there is no general resurrection at the end of time, there's no Jesus resurrection. No Jesus resurrection, no general resurrection. It never occurs to him, because it couldn't conceptually, that Jesus might be raised as a special privilege because he's the Messiah or he's the Son of God or whatever. By all means, ascension, fine. That's completely in the thinking of the whole Mediterranean. If I was a Roman, I would say your Jesus doesn't deserve it, but I have to admit that my Romulus got it, so maybe your Jesus would get it. I'm going to say, when I show you images of Jesus in Eastern Christianity raising Adam and Eve with him, you see it on the cover of the book behind me. Jesus is reaching out and taking Adam and Eve, who represent the human race. They ain't just two guys who he feels sorry for. When Jesus takes, in the Eastern tradition, not in the Western tradition, the Western tradition, he comes out all by himself, typical Western individualism. It's all about me. In the Eastern tradition, he comes out taking by hand Adam and Eve, the human race. Now, I've never had anyone able to tell me how Jesus literally took the human race out of the tomb with him. I have had people, and not silly, telling me how Jesus came out of the tomb all by himself. Of course, whether you think it happened or didn't happen, you can understand it. It's possible. But tell me how anyone could bring Adam and Eve out with him literally, and that changes the discussion. No, I think there are far, far bolder claims being made by saying Jesus saved the human race, Adam and Eve, than are being made by simply saying, well, he came out. In fact, when early Christian writer said, the big claim is not that he came out, the big claim is he didn't come out alone. So let me hold that and still try to get back to where we are. Is that all right? If there's other questions, we can come back to them by all means. So I think we're ready to look at the next one, which is the guarded tomb. So let me remind you, only in Matthew and then only in the gospel. Oh, there's a mistake down there. It says GT. I'm so used to writing GT for the Gospel of Thomas. I wrote GT instead of GP. In the guarded tomb, found only in Matthew, I put down the reasons for guarding the tomb. So the first one is in Matthew, talking to Pilate. We remember that this impostor said while he was still alive, after 3 days, I will arise. So command the tomb, keep it secure for 3 days. Otherwise, his disciples may go, steal him away, and tell the people he has been raised from the dead. That's Matthew. Only Matthew, by the way. Not in Mark, Luke, or John. The Gospel of Peter, that should be GP, as you can tell. Here's their reason. Give us soldiers that we may watch his sepulchre for 3 days, lest his disciples come and steal him away, and the people suppose that he is risen from the dead and do us harm. Now, when I looked at those two, I thought it looks more like to me that Matthew is a development of Peter than the reverse, because I was trying to imagine somebody reading Matthew, copying Matthew, and omitting that Jesus had said, after 3 days, I will rise again. Would you really omit that? And tell the people he has been raised and reduce it to the second one? Again, I leave it to your intelligence. You can compare them yourself, and you know how slippery the argument is. Somebody could easily argue one way or the other. But what all of this is pointing me towards, all these divergences, yeah, I'm pretty much convinced still that there is an independent source in the Gospel of Peter. I'm not convinced I can prove it's earlier. I'm not convinced I can prove. I think it's a draw. I think it's like giving two people a piece of text and saying, did A copy from B or B copy from A, or did both copy from C? It's very slippery when you don't have a huge amount of text. So let me go to the fourth one then, because this is the one we really have to spend some time on. Only in Matthew. Only in Matthew again. You get this. The earth shook, rocks were split, the tombs also were opened. Many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep. Now, not to say all, but many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Now, raised there could mean resurrection, or could mean, but were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Matthew, I think, has a fragment. He's trying to fit it into the narrative of his source, which is Mark. And as you can see, he's not doing too well. They kind of come out twice. It's like these people come out of the tomb when the rocks were split at the crucifixion of Jesus. And then they're sort of in a holding pattern, as it were, circling in Jerusalem, because they can't appear to meet people before Jesus. So he kind of brings them out of the tomb again. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs. Well, the tombs were opened. I guess, you could say they were held in the tombs or something. But that's all that Matthew gives us. Now, here's the Gospel of Peter, which is the only time that we get an attempt, at least, to actually describe the resurrection. Now, you can mock it, and people do, and say it's corny and everything else, but at least they're trying. So 2 men, it doesn't say 2 angels, come down to the sepulchre. And here's the story. 3 men came out of the tomb, 2 of them sustaining the other. What's behind that is court protocol, where somebody who's very important, say, going up to their throne or coming down for their throne, or maybe even a high priest or something, would have 2 people, one on either side, not just carrying him, but as it were, supporting his arms out of respect. A cross is following them. So you're trying to imagine kind of a wooden cross, I guess, following them. And the heads of the 2 reaching to heaven, but sorry, there's a mistake there. But the head of him led by the hand, overpowering the heavens. You can see I just prepared this yesterday for today, so they're done in a bit of a hurry. So what you're imagining is 3 people. You have the central figure, Jesus, and these 2 attendants who are kind of like supporting him, as it were, to show his importance. Jesus's head is taller from earth to heaven. They're trying to describe what the resurrection was like if you actually saw it. Now watch this. They heard, these are the guards at the tomb, by the way. They heard a voice out of the heavens, voice of God, crying, it's a question, have you preached? Now the term there is, the Greek verb is kerusein, which means have you proclaimed? You don't preach, in this case, in our sense. It's a proclamation. And the proclamation you're imagining is that Jesus went down to Hades and says, we're out of here. You don't preach to the dead and give them a nice sermon. You proclaim to the dead their exit strategy, as it were. Have you proclaimed to them that sleep? Now, notice we're using sleep again, as with Matthew, we're using in Peter again, for the dead. And from the cross was heard the answer, yes. So that's, of course, why I call my book The Cross That Spoke. And all sorts of people thought that was highly funny and talked about the cross and that spoke, ha, ha, ha. Yeah, but when the laughter is over, there's still a source. So if I were to make my argument backwards, I would say from that different description there of the resurrection itself, I don't know, would you say that Matthew has read that? He's read the Gospel of Peter and has shortened it? Or would you say the Gospel of Peter has read Matthew and expanded it from many bodies of the saints to them that sleep? The same word you remember that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 when he talks about Jesus as the first fruits of them that have slept. So now, hold on to that. Let me summarize where we are, if you're still with me and don't have a headache. The argument is, for me, that in the Gospel of Peter, a 2nd century document, dated to the 2nd century, dependent on those fragments, not on the big text. What you have is a source, a non-canonical source. Don't date it for a moment. A non-canonical source, which is trying to be reconciled, maybe a little defensively, like this is my story, and okay, I'll kind of put in bits from your story, but it's still basically my story. A reconciliation between the canonical versions and the non-canonical version. That leaves us with 2 other questions. Is the non-canonical version, the Gospel of Peter, earlier? Well, let me make it, is it independent? Maybe that's the core question. Is it independent? Even if it's written down, is it independent? I'm arguing it is. Because I really cannot see how you get from Matthew to that. I just don't know how to do it. In most cases, when I'm working with a source, I can say I can see how the change was made. For example, If I'm working with Matthew and looking at Mark, I can see why Matthew changed Mark. I can usually give you an argument at least. I don't know how you got from that. I would say that is independent. And then working backwards from that, I think the guards are independent in Peter, and I think the crucifixion is independent in Peter. Now, let me raise the bigger question, the far more important question today. So could I ask you please to put up the next one? Here's the bigger question. When Jacob asked me to talk about the cross that spoke, that was written in 1980, what do we say, 1988. Yeah, it's not like it's wrong and I repudiate. I don't. The only thing I will say about it is what I've said. Maybe I should have kept the argument just to what was most secure. There is a source and it is independent. I should have let it go at that, because I think any idea that there is a source out there independent of the New Testament gets so much opposition that it's almost hopeless. It's almost hopeless. So maybe I should have stuck to that and see if we could get any consensus on that. Anyway, whatever. Now, in the last 20 years, from 2000 on, Sarah and I traveled all over the Byzantine world. And that means not only east of Italy, shall I say, but even Italy and parts of Europe itself, because at one time, of course, before the year round numbers 1000, there was only Christianity. There wasn't Western and Eastern Christianity. There was Christianity in the West and Christianity in the East, but it came out of Constantinople and was just one Christianity. When it split, as it did split, first of all in the 11th century, and then irredeemably after the Fourth Crusade destroyed Byzantium, Constantinople, the resurrection split. The image in the West and the image in the East split completely. So I'm going to show you 3 pictures. They're chosen at random. Sarah and I have gigabytes of this stuff after we got back. We went every year from 2000 to 20, I think 15 was right the last year. Sometimes at least once a year, sometimes twice. One year we were there 3 times. We were trying to write the book and realize what we missed. Look at these 2 images. I have deliberately chosen ones painted or sculpted or whatever by the same person, so there is not too much of a clash of form. On one side of your screen, the left side, oh, by the way, this is from a wooden church, all wooden church, a stave church as they're called, in Norway, and these have been removed now to the Oslo Historical Museum. The date from about 1170, and I could have shown you earlier ones, but I just wanted to choose ones that are very visual. On the left, you see the classical, I call it the individual resurrection. By that, I mean that Jesus is coming out of the tomb all by himself, triumphant, magnificent, but definitely alone. I call it the individual resurrection. And in the Western tradition, it became normative. This is the way you expect it. If you go into, say, a series of scenes of the life of Jesus after the crucifixion, you might see the deposition, the burial. This is what you see. It's a very interesting one, actually, because I didn't choose it for this reason. You always have the soldiers. In this case, he's actually climbing out of the tomb. One leg is in, what's that? His left leg is in, his right leg is coming out, and he's kind of standing on a soldier. There's a lot of these in the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s. You say, well, why would he stand on a soldier when he's getting out? Wouldn't that wake up the guy? You notice the 2 behind them, they're sleeping. So the story from Matthew is, are they sleeping and don't see the resurrection? Or are they awake and lying and actually saw the resurrection? But this is the Western tradition. Jesus is usually carrying a banner. Now there's a cross. You can see a cross on the top of the banner, but the banner is a little bit like a crusader banner. He's coming out and he's fighting, as it were. But hold on to that image. Now turn to one by the same artist. I call it the universal resurrection. First of all, in the top right, you can see it should be Hades, but in the West, it's very often shown as hell. So Jesus is liberating people from hell, which creates all sorts of huge theological problems. I thought everyone in hell stayed there forever. And if they got out once, couldn't they get out again, etc., etc. So in theory, this is supposed to be Hades. Jesus is going down to Hades, the abode of the dead, and he's reaching out with one hand here, because in this one, he's holding his cross in his left hand. And he almost always is carrying the cross in this one. In this case, it's also a banner, but watch for that. So when you have the cross following him, remember that it's always the crucified one who liberates from Hades. We watch that as we go. But he's reaching out, and here you're just getting a whole crowd. But the two of them that are usually clearly visible are Adam and Eve. Let me go to the second one. I chose that one, to be honest with you, because it's from Norway and it's way off the beaten track. Here is a second one, a magnificent altar piece, which has, I don't know, maybe 30, 50 of these magnificent carvings. It's from, it's called the Verdun altarpiece because Nicholas of Verdun did it by almost the same age, 1181. It's in Klosterneuburg Abbey in Austria. Again, I've chosen the same artist doing both of them. You can see on the left, it's quite typical. There's a tendency in the iconography to have some of the guards sleeping and some of the guards watching or cowering. I don't know if they're sleeping or cowering, but you see very similar. The tomb is open. Jesus is climbing out. In the Western tradition, you get a whole period in which he's kind of still in the tomb, but getting out before you really get him out of the tomb, standing on it, and eventually drifting off from it. But he's coming out. The cross is there to remind you. And notice, I don't know if, yeah, you can see that if you close up, you can see his hands have the wounds on it. So in many ways, this is multiplied as this is the crucified one. See his halo has the cruciform on it as well. And underneath in Latin, Agnus Paschalis, the Paschal Lamb, underneath it. Now, these are right next to one another. So what's actually happening is this is the Western tradition, the individual resurrection. This is the Eastern tradition, but there's a period when they're sort of disentangling, when you're much more likely to get both. If you look at the one to the right, you can see why finally Jesus ends up standing on those soldiers. Because the tradition in the East was he's coming, well, no, he's not coming, he's liberating the dead from Hades. Well, who's in charge of Hades? Not Satan, of course, but Hades himself, the gatekeeper. He's just kind of standing behind the gates, and his job is to run the prison, as it were. The model is a prison. He keeps people in. That's his job. Jesus, as it were, comes bursting through the gates, stands all over poor old Hades. He's actually standing on him, and he reaches out with his hands. And as you can see, it's definitely Adam and Eve. It's kind of interesting in that one because his hands are really, Adam has his two hands up and Jesus is holding Eve by the hand. You can see her breast. So this is definitely Eve. And that's very unusual. It's usually, if he's holding one person, it's usually Adam before he becomes a sort of an equal opportunity resurrector, and he gives a hand to each as on the cover of the book. So again, individual, universal, and I'll go to my third example and then we can talk some more about it. if you would show the final example. This is the lovely, glorious Spanish chapel in Santa Maria Novella near the train station in Florence. And the dates are from 1400s, are from the 14th century, the 1300s. One is up on the ceiling. That's why I've just taken that arch over there in the individual resurrection. And down on the bottom, you have a magnificent one of the universal resurrection. And by the way, all of these are pretty much, well, I don't know if all of them, but they're in the book, Resurrecting Easter, and the subtitle tells you the story, how the West lost, I'm making a claim, how the West lost and the East kept the original Passion vision. In other words, my argument, I am not doing art history here. I'm doing art history to show you that the East and West have absolutely divergent imagery and theology for Easter, and that if, imagine with me, those First Corinthians came back at Paul and said, you know, Paul, you're always talking about this resurrection and crucifixion. Now, we know what crucifixion is like. We've seen the darn thing. But could you paint us a picture of the resurrection? I mean, what was it like, Paul? Like, if you'd been there, what would you have seen? Don't talk about the tomb. If you had been there, Paul, what's in your mind, Paul, when you say resurrection of Jesus? Tell us the image you got in there. Would Paul have drawn or described the Western one with Jesus coming out all by himself, or the Eastern one when he takes the human race out? That's my question. It's a biblical question. All right, so look at this last one. On the top one, you can see in the center, and this is probably one of the earliest images we have when Jesus is out of the tomb. Imagine that. I mean, there's lots of ones from about, say, 950 on where he's in the tomb, or where he's stepping out of the tomb, as we saw with one foot on the soldier, or when he's finally out of the tomb, like that, ascending. But if you take out, for example, the tomb, you wouldn't know what we're looking at. It looks like an ascension. In the top one there, taken from the ceiling, you can see the soldiers are, you know, if you can see them very clearly, but they're crouching down at the bottom. The angels are there. To the left, you can see the women coming to the tomb. So they've got everything there at the same. And on the right-hand side, you can see Mary Magdalene and Mary of Magdala and Jesus. But the center is probably, this is the earliest one where we finally get Jesus out of the tomb, clear out of the tomb, not standing on it, but ascending. Then if you shift down below, you see Jesus again. He's got his banner. It's usually, that's Western influence, you can tell. The two people who are there, he's holding the hand of Adam, who's in blue. Kneeling beside him, waiting her turn, as it were, is Eve. And then there's a whole crowd there afterwards. And over on the right-hand side are some very annoyed demons. Because as the Western influence overcame, as it were, the Eastern, at least in the West, you don't get liberation from Hades, you get liberation from hell. And that, as I said, created huge problems. I'll stop with this and open for some discussion then. A bishop wrote to Augustine, I think, I've forgotten the date, I think it was maybe around 400, I've forgotten the date. And he said, you know, if all these people came out of hell, now he's saying hell in Latin, not Hades, if all these people were liberated from hell by Jesus, then how do we know at the end of time there'll be anyone's in there? What if the same thing happened again, as it were? This poor bishop is stymied by this theology. And Augustine spends 3 pages on it, and you can tell he's really annoyed at the question because he doesn't have an answer. And Augustus doesn't like questions he doesn't have an answer for. And there are very few of them, by the way. And he says, look, the only ones who got out with Jesus were a couple of the prophets, and they had seen him and foretold him coming, So they recognized him. So they got out. Nobody else. And I say, excuse me, St. Augustus, with all due respects, Adam and Eve ain't two of the prophets. They're the human race. So however you explain this, whatever you want to do with it, in what we call today Eastern Christianity, Easter is about, however you explain it, and it needs to be explained, make no mistake about it, the human race is liberated with Jesus in his resurrection. So, okay.
Go ahead.
Let's see if there's any questions about that.
Right now, I don't got any other questions from the super chat, so I got some of my own.
Okay.
Do all four gospels, in your assessment, do they all use the cross gospel?
I don't know if I can prove that. I think in an argument, the most I get is a draw. So I don't want to really argue it anymore. I mean, for me today, to be honest with you, what has come down after 30 years as crucially important is that in the cross gospel, its account of the resurrection is much closer, again, to the Eastern tradition. And I think the Eastern tradition, by Eastern, I mean Eastern Christianity, of course, the Eastern tradition is far closer, I think, to the understanding of resurrection in Judaism, in Pharisaic Judaism, and in the first century. So I'm quite ready to argue that if you're reading the Gospel of Peter on the resurrection, you're far closer to the resurrection tradition than you are anywhere in the West. Anywhere in the West. Now, I mean, I think that's the important part. So that what I would say is, I think if I try to argue on the guarded tomb, I think somebody say Matthew is more original, Peter is more original. I don't know, Jacob, if I get much better from an impartial judge, then that's a draw. I don't think we have enough data. If I had the whole gospel of Peter, maybe it'd be like having, the version of Q or something. You don't have enough. So I really want to focus my argument now, and kind of wish I did it then, just to make the argument, because a lot of scholars who read that account of the Jesus coming out and the head reaching all the way to heaven thought, oh, how stupid. Okay. They totally ignored Eastern Christianity. Mm. I didn't think much of it till I started traveling all over every summer and began to realize, wait a minute, this isn't some weird thing that happened once. This is the entire Eastern Christianity from about the year 700 on. This is their tradition. And then the second thought that struck me is, I think that tradition is far closer to the New Testament than our stuff, the Western. So now after 30 years, that's when you asked me to do the cross that spoke. I didn't want it just simply to be a debate over sources. I wanted to say, okay, they've got a description of Jesus coming out of the tomb, as it were, being followed by a cross, and the cross speaking. Ha, 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 ha. Everyone mocked. But what he says, the question from heaven is, have you proclaimed liberation? That's understood. Have you proclaimed liberation to them that sleep? They're not really dead, as it were, you're just waiting. Them that sleep. And the voice from the cross says, yes. Then I turn to this tradition, and I find that Jesus is usually carrying a cross. Now, in the Western, we saw carrying a banner, but in the Eastern tradition, it's a cross. And when you get like the cover of my book, or our book, Resurrecting Easter, when Jesus is using both his hands, one for Adam, one for Eve, very often you'll get above his head, you'll get angels carrying the cross for him. Because after all, he needs his hands. But in all the original ones, when he's one-handed, when he's just reaching out with one hand, he's always carrying the cross. So the message I'm getting from the cross that spoke now is that you cannot separate the execution from the resurrection. It's the executed one that is the one who was executed by unjust violence for just non-violence, is what saves the human race. That's how I read this, if you wanted to call it a myth or anything else. I read it that the salvation of the human race down here on this earth of our species is whether we can get control of violence without controlling it by excessive violence, which ain't working too well for us. So I see Jesus crucified for nonviolent resistance, executed for nonviolent resistance, as the great revelation, as Paul did, of the general resurrection. Paul still believed in the general resurrection, of course. That was going to happen pretty soon. We know he was off by that. I bracket it completely. But the question is whether there's a revelation of justice and injustice when you look at the execution of Jesus.
Do you think Paul was aware of the cross gospel?
Was he aware of the cross gospel? Oh, no. But Paul was aware of. Paul was a Pharisee. Okay, forget Paul now, the apostle or anything. Paul was a Pharisee. He tells us he was a Pharisee. And he tells us he was a super pious Pharisee. The Pharisees were distinguished by two things. Tradition, they claimed there were oral traditions that had come down to them all the way from Sinai, which is one heck of a gotcha, by the way. It's like me claiming I have a revelation from Jesus that says my books are really good. Good try. So they have secret, as it were, oral traditions that have been passed down. Sadducees might have the written tradition than the Bible, but they have oral traditions. So tradition. But the second thing that distinguishes Pharisees against Sadducees, this comes up quite often in the New Testament. Remember the trick question to Jesus about the woman with 7 husbands, when they all die, who gets her in heaven? That's kind of mocking Pharisees. Mocking at Pharisees. So the second thing we believe in is there is justice in this world, because at the end there will be a great big court case in which every human being who has ever lived is going to be judged, and then they will either go to heaven or hell. Now, when I hear that, I don't believe in it for 1 second, literally. I find it radically absurd, and that's why you have all these jokes about what about cannibals and all the rest of it, who's eaten somebody else. But what I take with absolute consuming seriousness is whether there is just in this world justice. I'm not talking about God. I really am it. I want to know whether evolution is a just system. Whether, in other words, we can't get away with destroying the world without consequences, escalatory violence without consequences. When I read all of this, I see it as an early distant warning of the question, are we a sustainable species? Not are we sustainable with oil and all the rest of it. The answer to that's already in. And whether we've a sustainable environment, the answer is touch and go. Are we a sustainable species? That's what I see through this early distant groping of somebody like Paul about a just world and all the rest of it. That's what's at stake for me. And it's far more important than argument about sources. So I want to make certain that the implications of what is at stake are clear as well.
Final question. What do you make of, no, let me rephrase. When do you date the Q document and the cross gospel, or do you think they could date around the same time?
No, I think the big, how would I put it? The big watershed moment is the Great War of 66 to 74. Before that, we had 2 gospels. I'm going to call one the gospel according to Q. Now, I presume your audience knows that Q is the source used by Matthew and Luke apart from Mark. So it presumes that you have, if you're looking at your gospels in parallel columns, which is the only way to do it, you can see Matthew, Mark, Luke. Then you see that Matthew and Luke consistently have another source besides it, It's simply called Q for Quelly. I'm sure most of your audience knows that. Call it the X-Files if it makes you more at home. I call it the Gospel according to Q. That's there, I would date by the 50s to 60s, before the war. That's how I judge it. Do I get anything about the destruction of Jerusalem? The other gospel that's there is what Paul calls my gospel. Let's call it the Gospel according to Paul. So I would date them both from the 50s. Let's say the 50s, put a date on it. The Gospel according to Q is sayings by Jesus. It's a sayings gospel. The narrative, there's not much of a narrative. There's incidents, but you won't get a movie bestseller out of Q or out of Paul, out of the letters. So there's a gospel of sayings of Jesus and a gospel of letters about Jesus. Those are both there before the war. And here's what's fascinating about it. The gospel according to Q has nothing whatsoever about a resurrection. Not even a glimpse of it. There might be a hint of ascension, only in the sense that Jesus seems to be somewhere and he's going to come back. If you're kind of somewhere coming back, you must be somewhere. Like if you're coming back, you must be somewhere. So maybe, but they don't make any fuss about it or any emphasis, maybe Jesus has ascended into heaven from which he will return. That's in Q. But Q is really interested in wisdom comes down to earth and is repulsed, rejected, goes back to heaven. It's a pattern. Jesus is wisdom incarnate coming down to earth. What are you going to expect? He has to go back. He's rejected. So it's a different theology. The theology of Q and the theology of Paul are different theologies. I don't see anyone better than the other. Q emphasizes more the life of Jesus. Paul emphasizes more the death and resurrection. But they're simply different theologies. Now, there's not a glimpse of this source there. I think even the source I'm thinking of is certainly after the resurrection, definitely after the resurrection.
We have a super chat question from John Backer. Thank you for the $5. What connection do you think this gospel has to do with Peter? Why is it necessarily tied to Peter's name? Thank Jacob for a great show. Thanks, John.
I'm wondering, John, the only reason I could hint is that Peter may be already in the ascendancy, because we know, obviously, of course, for Matthew. And this gospel is linked again and again to Matthew, not exclusively, because the good thief is Luke, but there are some close connections with Matthew. Now, if you think it's based on Matthew, you're going to say, well, it picks on Peter because of thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. If not, the opposite way. So I think it's part of the ascendancy of Peter. I think what's happening very early is that Paul is too controversial. He's too controversial, even probably for a lot of his own members in his communities, because Paul has a vision of resurrection. And that's a Pharisaic vision. Paul, for me, never stopped being a Pharisaic. He just became a Messianic Pharisaic. And what struck Paul, and I think made it easier for him to convert, was, wait a minute, I've always believed there was a general resurrection, and here's these weirdos over here that I'm persecuting, but they're saying, what if Jesus is resurrected, not ascended? Wow. Then I'm right as a Pharisee, and I'm right as a Messianic Pharisee. That's how I can imagine a conversion. I don't understand a conversion when everyone gives up 100% from A to B. That's called psychosis, as far as I'm concerned. There has to be some kind of a link, a pivot that makes it possible to say, well, I was totally against this, but on the other hand, So I think if you're dealing with the linkage with Matthew, it's the ascendancy of Peter. You get it in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter is almost more important than Paul, despite all the room he gets, because He's the one who's the apostle of the Gentiles for Luke. So I think it's the ascendancy of Peter that's at work here.
Thanks again for that super chat, John. Well, thank you for joining me once again, Professor John Dominic Crossan. I thank the audience for their participation. I thank those that super chatted, helps me continue this channel. And once again, I thank everybody's participation in the live chat. Until next time, I will see all of you later.
By the way, Jacob, your audience should know you got a premiere today. We've never done this before.
Yeah, this is the first time we
put those two.
You and I streamed together. Yeah, the last time was pre-recorded.
Yes.
The link to that and to both of his books he has behind him will be below, so you can go purchase them.
Thank you very much, Jacob.
Yep. Thank you. Bye-bye. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.